Welcome again to the April edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike.
Zach.
We've got some stuff to talk about. It's been a little over a month. We now have in the rearview mirror the 2018-2019 winter.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it was a good one. So I think we should do a postmortem on this winter. And as you know, as we all know, we're sort of heading into the heat season, and not too far in the future, we have the glorious monsoon to look forward to.
Monsoon countdown begins.
Does it begin now?
Let's do it. Start it right now.
Why don't we step back and do the big picture first? What do you think is the winter narrative?
The winter or winter? The winter narrative?
The winter narrative. You could do the winter narrative too.
I don't know if this is going to be a winter narrative. The winter narrative. El Niño gets all the credit. I say boo on that. No.
Why do you? Is that the sort of media narrative out there?
It's been interesting. I've been out talking to folks, and it's kind of caught on to people's imagination that, man, wasn't this a good El Niño winter? And I'm like, really? Yeah. I mean, it was a great winter.
It was an El Niño, barely. People call it.
Yeah.
NOAA calls it a puny. They
called it puny.
A puny.
I mean, it's not even a technical term. I don't think.
It barely registered.
Right.
If you want to parse the numbers, I guess it was just slightly over that critical threshold.
Right.
But nonetheless, it gets into the El Niño box, if you will.
Yeah, I think in the statistics, it will be kind of drifting towards the middle, so it's not going to stick out in the ends, the outliers. But yeah, you're right. It's still going to go in the win column for El Niño in part. But I think that narrative it's too simple. It's just like, good solid play from your team, and then somebody slam dunks, and that's all they remember at the end. So I think the mess of weather all through the winter without a lot of coherent forcing is really the narrative. I think MJO was solid MVP for most of the winter, but even in the last 2 months, El Niño kind of showed up, played a little bit, put a little effort into it. MJO has actually waned now and has not really been the mechanism forcing things. I think we've got a little bit of residual El Niño-ish kind of circulation pattern right now, but then just the mess of weather has just continued across the continental U.S.
How many MJOs were there then?
I don't know. 6, 12, 14? I'm not sure.
Well,
coherent. You're talking about coherent waves
when you say
kind of passing
when you
through.
say that it was an MVP, I guess sort of the narrative for me is let's just include October in the.
Oh man, yeah, okay.
Okay, so let's look at the last 6 months. Mm-hmm. Really, what stands out to me is the very wet across the West October.
Yeah,
and then the really wet this February.
I think that's right. I think that's a good breakdown. So October, multiple recurver, tropical storms, hurricanes, decaying hurricanes moving through the Southwest.
It's kind of hard to call that the winter.
I think it is too. It didn't feel it was actually cool out. I mean, it was, I think the month as a whole.
I really think it argues for having like 4 distinct seasons. You have the monsoon.
Most places do have 4 seasons. Yeah. That's not a thing. I mean, like not an unusual thing.
Well, we won't call it, summer, winter,
right.
Autumn, and spring. We'll call it monsoon, hurricane.
Okay. Monsoon, hurricane.
Or remnant hurricane.
Okay.
Which I think would be October.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of November.
Nah. Yeah. Probably not.
Just October.
Yeah.
Then winter. So we'll do November through March.
Okay.
Or we could even throw in April there.
Okay.
Now you're agreeing with me.
I'm really pushing back. I was just going to agree with everything you said. Now I feel like I can't.
Oh, what do you disagree with?
No, I think it's good. So, and I was thinking, okay, you're talking about in general.
And then the heat season.
The heat season.
Yeah.
I like that.
May and June.
May and June. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, right. I'm taking us on a tangent. Now go back.
No, it's good. You're trying to break down the year so we can talk about it coherently.
Yeah. Okay. So
that's what you were trying to do. Right?
That's what I was trying to do.
Okay.
I don't think it was working.
Okay. October is hurricane season. Is that what you called it?
Remnant tropical
remnant
storm
low season.
Here.
Remnant tropical storm season. Yeah. So this year, a couple recurvers, lots of subtropical moisture, and the interaction with some low pressure systems coming in, which you'd normally see in October transition. But we had the moisture. So we were able to do some gangbuster rain events all the way through the month. It was a really busy month. I think, went there something like 10 10 coherent rain events throughout the month, stacking up on each other.
In Tucson, close to 3 inches of rain.
Yeah, crazy. Very unusual in the record. Often we'll blank Octobers. That's not that hard to do.
Put that in perspective, though. For Tucson, when you look at the total from October through the end of May, the total is 5 inches. So just 3 alone in October is quite impressive.
Yeah, pushing up the water year total is going to be dominated once we get to the end of September. If the monsoon is just even where near normal, it's going to be dominated by that early October stuff from October of 2018. Yeah, we blanked October. So October of 2018, last October, no rain at all. So it was just such a stark contrast to what we saw.
And that's a high variability month.
It's a huge high variability
because it's all dependent upon whether or not there's activity in the East Pacific and whether or not they actually recurve into our area.
I think largely the big precip events in the October historical record are tropical related, and it's just a little tougher for the wintertime activity to get this far south in there. And if they can interact with some of that lingering monsoon moisture, but it's typically a waning month for us for sure, coming out of the monsoon season. Yeah, if you look since 2010, we've had 2 Octobers, 2014 and 2018, with no precip here in Tucson. 2013 was a trace. 2012 was 0.06. 2017 was 0.1. So typically you get a little bit of dribble of precipitation. 2016, though, 2.25 inches. That was on the tail of the Uber El Niño, Godzilla El Niño, 2015, 2016, still having an active East Pacific hurricane season in that fall season.
Boy, I'm looking at Phoenix.
Yeah, I know.
I forgot. Phoenix was just absolutely drenched.
We had that large scale flooding event with, I believe it was Sergio or Rosa. I can't remember which one was which. Went through and then flooded out the whole downtown.
I seem to have blacked out.
Were you
October.
Even here?
I mean, they received 5 inches of more than 5 inches of rain. Yeah. That's more than in the month of October, they received more rain than historically what occurs between October and May.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, and so you look at the cumulative curves they're kind of ridiculous with October in it. They usually work pretty well because October is a pretty tame month. So the accumulations occurring after that really contribute to the cool season totals. But
how widespread was that? Do you recall?
It was big. It was very widespread.
Was it just the Southwest, or was it more interior? Did it waft up into the interior West?
It tracked through Arizona from like Tohono O'odham in the southern part of the state up through the middle part of the state and caused some flooding up in Navajo. And then I believe it clipped Utah and went up into Colorado. But it was ground zero. I mean, if you remember, this is when like the Weather Channel was driving around in trucks looking for flooding in October. I mean, there was no severe weather going on. Storm chasing turned into wash chasing in Arizona, which is a sad state of affairs for storm chasing for sure. So we could talk about October all year.
Yeah, no.
And I think we should because it was probably
No, I was going to say let's move on because we've covered that terrain.
Okay, November was boring. It dried out. It warmed up. It wasn't off the charts warm like it was last fall in 2018, but it was enough to make us, I think, all a little bit itchy that we were going to do last winter over again. And so it took all the way until the middle of December for the storm track to actually shift down into Arizona again. And it really wasn't until the last week of December that we started to get busy.
Well, both Tucson and Phoenix did not have any rain in November.
No. I think technically the last day of the month, it was a buzzer beater. Yep. It was November 30th.
You're right.
It got logged into the books. And I think Tucson ended up having 0.07 of an inch in November, but it was literally at the last day of the month. The first 2 weeks of December were warm again, kind of bumped around, and the pattern totally shifted from the 15th on, and it was that last week. And then it's just been, we haven't had to wait around long for something interesting to happen.
There was a pretty prolonged drying out in the latter half of January.
Yeah, that's right. So I think just having the transition from the beginning of December into the end of December, and then get a snow event and then get another rain event, it kind of made me forget that we had a couple of stretches. The activity picked up again in February, again with both a low elevation snow event and some pretty warm, kind of atmospheric rivery precip events for Tucson that it just kept going. I mean, this year we can kind of look back through it from monsoon of 2018 up to present, and we've had just about every kind of weather event that Tucson can get anyways, and I think more broadly across the Southwest, especially in the Arizona side.
Did we have an atmospheric river? We did.
We did.
Had one that like sort of thread the needle, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thread the needle. It was in February.
That's
and
right.
It real high snow levels, lots of rain, and it was interacting with all that snowpack that we had built up through the season too. And so we put down some really big flows in some of the rivers in Arizona.
So February ended up for Arizona becoming it was the 5th wettest in 125 years.
It's pretty good. We've had February is a wet month for Tucson, or for Arizona anyways. To get up in the books that high is saying something. And so New Mexico, though, I think we have to kind of reiterate too, being more broad about the Southwest with CLIMAS, is that New Mexico hasn't had as much fun, I think, as we have.
If you just look at February, the trajectory of the storms were sort of going southwest to northeast.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so
they were clipping us.
Yeah.
They were on the dry side of a lot of these storms. And
it wasn't that in February, it wasn't that New Mexico was completely dry.
Right. I mean, it's
in fact, actually the Four Corners region, and that's part of the trajectory of the storms.
Yeah.
In New Mexico, the Four Corners region did experience some rain. It was just
right.
the southeast.
The far eastern has been kind of left out of the action. And we can have jet stream patterns too, where real strong subtropical jets in some El Niño events where all the activity is south of us. And so we're on the dry northern side of that activity in Arizona. And then you can get this real hard cut where New Mexico goes very wet and Arizona goes very dry. And it's been the opposite with having that activity more focused over Arizona. It's left New Mexico on the dry side.
The other thing about February was that it was wet across the West. Aside from New Mexico, which was just, if you looked at the statewide average, it just came in at a round average. Everywhere else was above average and much above average. Like I said, Arizona as a statewide average was 5th wettest. California was 4th wettest in its record. Nevada was the 5th wettest. Utah was the 10th wettest. Colorado was the 15th wet. Everywhere except for New Mexico and Washington State in the West was. So it was a pretty banner year.
Yeah. Yeah.
February was.
February, right.
Actually, if you look at all of the U.S., it was the wettest, or the second wettest in 125 years for the entire...
Second wettest 125 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And the drought monitor is really telling that story. I mean, broad improvements. There is no extreme drought in the continental U.S. right now.
February was a really good year, particularly for those who were ski enthusiasts. I know we talked about that. The snowpack was off the charts in a lot of areas, particularly California, which saw just a whole bunch of those atmospheric rivers that just like pounded the Sierras with a lot of snow, which is good for the water situation. But let's move along to March. So March here in Tucson was basically a one event wonder. It's a month that tends not to receive that much rain to begin with. I think the average is about 3/4 of an inch. And that one event produced about 0.6 at the airport. I don't know, Mike, any thoughts on March? It's kind of what you would expect, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of years, again, thinking about Tucson, just because I happen to have that data handy, we have often been below that. And so I think to even come close to that this year I was quite pleased with that. I mean, we've seen this sort of kind of retreat of some of that spring precipitation ending a little bit earlier every year. And so for it to extend even into the middle part of March, I was quite pleased with. And we've even seen some precip events extending into April now. But the March event, was a pretty good, solid west-wide event, kind of coming in on the 11th of March and then putting down some good widespread precipitation across both Arizona and New Mexico over the 12th and the 13th. Some pretty heavy rain, 1 to 2 inches in some of the higher elevation locations.
So it was also an active month for the interior West.
Yeah. Again,
Nevada, Utah, and Colorado were all within top 10 of their wettest months. And that's important for snowpack and stream flow, which we'll talk about in a minute, because a substantial amount of of snow can fall in March in the high country.
Right.
The other thing that has been remarkable for me was just how cool it seemed, how cold it seemed. And we talked about a little bit about this on the last pod, but while it was colder than average, it was much colder than it had been over the last 6-7 years.
Yeah.
It sort of made me think about, I'm getting kind of soft, I guess.
Well, I think it's the recency bias of, all of our sort of climate minds is that we maybe bring a year with us when we're thinking about our expectations for any given month. And so I think having last year happen and then this year in succession, thinking about last fall and last winter being so dry and so warm, record, followed by this year being so much cooler and so much wetter. I think that's what's been so striking about it with me. And we had periods throughout this whole since October where October being so wet was cooler than we normally experience and I think statistically, if we look at the climatology, I can't remember if it's probably slightly below average. Probably wasn't the coldest ever or anything like that. November was
slightly below average.
Was slightly below average, yeah, which would make sense with the precip in that particular month. November, I think, was slightly above average. And then December was a mixed bag because the precip came late. January, like you said, it dried out and warmed up in the later part of the month. So you get a wash. February, I'm not sure. What was the temps for February?
I think they were below average.
Below average? Yeah. We had the low elevation snow event, and
we had just about on average over the full winter the same amount of freezing days as average. Which,
right.
Which it's average, but it's been more than they have been in the past.
Exactly. Yeah. So that average
10 years or so.
Yeah. So back to 48, you can see the trend certainly starts to play with this whole perceptional issue here is that at the end of the trend where we're seeing most of the warming in the last couple of years, it's a word. Look it up. Yeah, it's hyphen. There's a hyphen in it.
We'll get a word check on that.
We get a fact checker too. Then we're done. The podcast is over. Just to your point, I was trying to help you out here. I was trying to help your point out is that we're coming in at I think the type of winter that was more frequent earlier in the record. We're now seeing it, and it just stands out because it's been so warm and dry in the last couple of years with the trend.
So again, zooming out, I mentioned this a minute ago, but zooming out and thinking about the U.S. as a whole, I mean, it is striking that this is, and I saw some data that said it was the wettest, and I've seen other data or reports that said it's the second wettest. I'm looking at one here from NOAA that calls it the second wettest on record. So
for February.
That is for February. But when I look at this from October through March, this is the second wettest.
Okay. Yep.
As a U.S. average.
For the continental U.S.,
right? For the continental U.S. That is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Can we wave our hand at
what might
be driving this?
Yeah.
The thoughts that I was sort of tossing in my head this morning was related to the Arctic. We had a loose lid on the Arctic, so we had more cold outbreaks, which might have pushed down the storm track, which might have allowed for more. Yeah, I'm sort of making stuff up.
It's good. I like it. I like where you're going. I
mean, it was also an El Niño, so we had some tropical.
I know, and so I went back and I read some of the synoptic summaries that National Climatic Data Center wrote up. I in particular read the March one. They do this really cool thing where they'll take the month. So they just wrote up the March one. So they go back and they actually look at the whole evolution of all the synoptic patterns, all the circulation patterns, and the indices, and then they try to match them up to look at what they try to do attribution basically.
Different things at different months.
Yeah, and so I just looked at March because that was the one that was available. Go back and look at some of the other ones. We could go back and look at the February one in particular. So I think if we go back to March, when in that particular write-up, they didn't find any one single strong driver. They saw a mix of kind of weather scale events. And so then the attribution, MJO, not really. And so not really. Mm-hmm. You had kind of a mixed signal. Some of the other, like the Pacific North America pattern showed up, came and went, didn't really match the overall precipitation pattern. So they just saw it kind of as a mess of an active weather pattern without blocking. February, we can go back to that. It may be a little bit more El Niño coming online with February. The MJO was still active in February too. And the MJO and El Niño, I think the MJO was more active December, January, and then kind of gave over to the dominant El Niño signal in February.
But when you look at February and you look at sort of the
pattern,
state averages, like
they don't really match up, do they?
Well, I mean, some of the states that are blinking on at much above average are those states that have an El Niño correlation, but a lot of them don't.
Yeah, I know. The southern tier states in February.
In fact, right, like Florida was very, very dry.
Yeah,
and Texas was dry, and those are areas that tend to see more rain during an El Niño. I mean, I read a few stories, and the media narrative, I think, is making this unnuanced, and you're bringing a little bit more nuance to this, but it's like, it was
That's what I do, yeah.
It was like, it's an El Niño year, and as if El Niño affects the entire continent in the same way at the same time.
Right.
And I think that's a kind of a spurious comment.
Well, I think it's just an oversimplification, right? And I think that's the real challenge. We'll probably talk about this too, is that El Niño equals wet here in the Southwest. I wish it were that way. I mean, I think I certainly was of that thinking, that simplistic thinking, going into some of our more recent El Niño events, but it's just so much more complicated than that. It's going to
so then what do you take when what do you take away from El Niño? We tend to want to simplify things in our minds, and like we want to draw out what the big picture is or the important point. The simple wet El Niño, dry La Niña story is very much in the media narrative.
Yeah.
And it's unnuanced.
Uh-huh.
Where does that leave you when you're coming into an El Niño year?
Probably more skeptical of, anticipating certain patterns than I have ever been. And I think the lessons learned of the 2015-16, where it was a bit of a house of cards, I think, on our expectations around that. I mean, and that was even under the real strong event expectation of the anomalies to sort out the way that they had in the past. And they didn't. And so when we watched this event, remember we had a moderate La Niña last year. It wasn't a bang up super strong one, but it did its job. I think that the attribution for the last winter, I think probably tag it on a La Niña event.
Weak, moderate.
Yeah, weak, moderate, right? But that pattern seemed to shake out as being the La Niña attribution there. But again, maybe I'm over attributing La Niña as the cause of the mess that we got ourselves into last winter with it being so epically dry. But we didn't have a lot else to go on. And then that waned last spring, and then we saw the development of an El Niño coming, and it's never kind of fully matured until just the last minute. So it's been a background player at best. And even so, I pulled up the February NCDC report, and they don't even want to give El Niño that much credit for the February pattern. The PNA and the Pacific North America pattern.
Well, I guess that's
a couple of other teleconnection patterns seem to match a little bit better.
Guess that's where I was going with your sort of month breakdown and your sort of description that there's a lot of things going on. And when you look at it at the month and you try to diagnose the synoptic patterns, like you're drawing from a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
And that's probably the case
all the time. Yeah. I think that's right. Well, I think that, we've seen in the past where some of these big El Niño events in the right time of the year become such monolithic drivers of atmospheric circulation that that's still not even 100% at that point, but you're getting up there where it's like it's now taking over a lot of the northern hemisphere circulation pattern in the wintertime. And I think we kind of expected that in 2015-16. We saw a huge footprint of it across the northern hemisphere, but it wasn't quite the footprint, especially in Arizona, that we would have expected in the past, given like how 83.
Well, it was such a big perturbation of the atmosphere.
Yeah, it was huge. It's an enormous amount of energy you're dumping in a different spot, and you expect it. And so, I guess to your point about this year, it's a little blip. It's not that big of an anomaly. The atmosphere has responded. The Walker circulation has weakened. There's been some slight shift in the easterlies, not a particularly good big one. And so, if that's the case, then every weather event we've had from October to now, we can't. I just feel like we can't give it too much credit.
Let's talk a little bit about the impacts of the winter. So we had a pretty wet winter across the West, maybe with the exception of the far Pacific Northwest. Good for drought. as you mentioned.
Yeah, good for water, which you're going to talk about.
Yeah, we can talk about snowpack. Good for water. Potentially bad though in other respects. Right. A couple things come to mind.
Why you got to bring it down?
We got to make this nuanced.
Okay.
Because hey, the pollen has been.
Okay, that's true.
The allergy season has been, and I use my wife as a judge because I'm not.
You don't have the allergies.
I don't have allergies, but it's been a pretty bad season so far, largely from the October rains.
Yeah, yeah. The timing of the rains were perfect for the desert. We had super bloom in the Mojave Desert, in Anza Borrego, and southern Arizona.
That's right.
And it's now like full on yellow flower season. You know, all that fall rain ends up germinating.
Poppy apocalypse.
Apocalypse. Yes. I drove from here to San Diego and Papapalooza, Papachella. So yeah, I did that drive from here to San Diego in a couple weeks ago, and I couldn't believe the.
Well, the funny stories that are coming out is they're all upset at the millennials for getting out and taking selfies and trampling all the poppies.
Oh no! And it's all millennials too. Huh?
Totally, no. That's the narrative. They're laying down and like stomping on the poppies, and so there's been like a number of stories written about it.
It's finally good to be a Gen Xer. That's no other reason.
Yeah. So the pollen season's been particularly bad.
It has been bad. I can vouch for that as well.
So what about the wildfire season? Because we're coming into that right now, and obviously the wet winter, I guess in my mind, it can have opposite effects. So maybe in the low country, in the deserts, the precipitation will fuel a lot of sort of fine fuel and shrub growth. Yeah. Which when you slap on the heat season, it doesn't take long for those fuels to dry out. Right. And then that sort of sets the stage for elevated fire risk in maybe the lower elevations.
Absolutely.
But then with the higher snowpack in the high countries, you have a longer, well, depending on how rapid the warm up is, but it hasn't been that rapid so far.
Yeah.
You have longer lasting soil moisture and sort of suppresses the risk immediately or this upcoming season for the high country. So it's sort of a mixed bag there.
You should see this sort of divergence where you have low elevation fire danger and higher elevation reduction in fire danger. I think just what you just said, because those heavier fuels are going to be wetter at the higher elevations, and it's going to be cooler, and it's going to extend. And we could maybe close the gap right to the monsoon season and limit that risk. But the low elevations will cure out pretty regularly in May.
Doesn't take long.
And then they're fine fuels, so they will dry out quickly, and typically it's windy in May. And so you'd expect the fire danger to go, kind of through the roof, which is what NIFC, the National Interagency Fire Center seasonal fire outlook, does suggest that there's an enhanced wildfire risk across southern Arizona and the low deserts, and then southern New Mexico, I believe, too, with that fine fuel issue.
Well, what about, though, a lag for the high country? Like, so the wet winter develops or fuels growth of understory and it takes a little bit longer to dry out, and so maybe there isn't an immediate risk. But if we were to have a dry winter this winter, perhaps it sets the stage for future years.
That's like Tom Swetnam and Huey Betancourt's work, and some others. Tony Westerling is found some of these.
If I didn't read those, then is that my idea?
You did. I mean, go try to publish it. See what happens. Yeah, that's been demonstrated, and it's been demonstrated in the research.
I thought I had a good idea.
It's a good idea. And it's because it's been shown to be true. You can get these lagging, right? You can get offsets of years, looking for that'll sync up with the El Niño, field production, drought, and then seeing the fire activity. And it'll be elevationally dependent. And I actually did a little of this with my dissertation work too. I actually wrote a paper on this as well. So
I definitely
I'm going to cite myself.
We can get a little bit more into the fire in the next podcast, because we'll be more in the throes.
I think we should lean into it then. Yeah, I think you've been so giddy about the water situation, though. I think you need to take off on that.
Okay, yeah. Let's look at the snowpack. So we've chronicled the snowpack situation, which mirrors for the most part the precipitation that we've already talked about. So it's not a surprise that with a very wet winter comes high levels of snowpack. But what's currently the case right now is that most of the West, with the exception of actually, the Gila, with the exception of Arizona and again the Pacific Northwest, all of the high country has a above average snowfall. And one thing that I thought was interesting, at least for Arizona, where Flagstaff is one of a few of the SNOTEL sites that still has above average snow. It's that the melt season has been a little bit later. It's substantial melt usually occurs starting a couple weeks ago, and it just started right now. So.
Yeah, and I think that we can have wet winters across the West that aren't quite as productive, I think, snow-wise too. I think it's highly correlated, but we can end up having slightly warmer, wet winters. This one has just been there's been a persistent cool anomaly that's helped this snowpack be so healthy this year. So I think that it's been, it's not super subtropical, El Niño-y high snow level, it's been kind of this mix of cold storms dropping out, interacting with moisture, has really helped the snowpack along this year. And, it's something you're probably not going to get every year, especially into a warming world.
And the other implication of this has been for stream flow. There's some optimistic news for the Colorado, at least. Most of the reservoirs in the Southwest here are seeing a bump in reservoir levels. But the projection from the Bureau of Reclamation for spring stream flow of inflow into Lake Powell is something like 130% of average. So a press release from the Bureau, John Fleck, who's at the University of New Mexico, who writes a lot about water in the West, had a nice blog post where he discussed projections for Lake Mead elevation. And between February and March, the projected inflow into Lakes Mead and Powell were so high that basically Lake Powell is going to release, I think, 9 million acre feet this year into Lake Mead, which will basically, as opposed to what they normally release under less copious inflow, is 7.5 million acre feet. Okay. So that additional 1.5 million acre feet will increase elevation in Lake Mead to be around 1081, I think.
No kidding.
1075 is that threshold where it goes into shortage.
Yeah,
agreement.
Still flirting with disaster, but that's still good.
Right,
yeah.
But it kicked the can down the road 1 year and reduced chances of shortage declaration in 2021 as well. So
to me, what's interesting is that it really. It's evidence of how precarious the situation is that we can have the second wettest February on record, and that's what it gets us. For it didn't solve it by bringing it up 25 feet. It brought it up a couple feet.
But I think those numbers of increased by 6 feet of elevation. Maybe it sounds small, but that's a ton.
No, I'm not diminishing. I'm just saying this is a decades long recovery problem. We need to do this winter 10 more times,
right?
To get us so far from the edge of the shortage to not worry about it anymore.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I'm not a water person, but the story on the Colorado is that there's what they call the structural deficit.
Right.
So that in an average year, the river itself fully allocated is over allocated by 1.2 million acre feet.
There you go.
So, and I don't know that there's so many. It's a complicated story. So I don't know if all of the allocations are taken every single year. But if they are, I mean, you have to get 130% of average basically just to equal what's taken out of it.
Yeah,
and so,
right.
And so
that's a good point.
That's why you see the decline. Although, there is, news, good news on the drought contingency plan for the Bureau of Reclamation, because they just signed in the legislation actually an interim deal to deal with that structural deficit. Mm-hmm. We won't spend we're not water people here. So but encourage people to look that up because
I think
and it's contentious too because actually
it absolutely is.
One of the major key players, Imperial Irrigation District, was not part of the agreement. They're the people that manage Salton Sea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's real issues there with public health issues and the declining saltancy and asthma and all this kind of stuff. It's a worthy story worth doing a little research on.
The water needs to go everywhere to keep the impacts low. I mean, that's kind of a truism in its own right, but there's so many moving parts and so many players and so much at stake with this, is that having this winter, I think, bought us a little bit of time. It'll be interesting what we do with the time going forward.
Yeah, I think for the most part, water managers will take it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say bring on the pluvial. That's on my T-shirt.
1980s.
That's right.
Bring back the 1980s.
That's right.
Mike, anything else you want to say about drought? Or, we talked a little bit about the impacts. We didn't spend too much time on drought, other than it looks like a good state. Anything from the drought monitoring? No,
I think that the short-term improvements have been very good, very healthy improvements. So we're looking at this, month to seasons aspect. The reservoirs are our sort of long-term indicator of longer-term deficits. And so like I said, I think to truly get us out of sort of long-term drought, we need to do this winter again a couple more times in a row, quite honestly. Yeah. And that doesn't come along very often in the paleo record. You don't see these kinds of winters stack up on each other. So we'll just have to kind of be vigilant, keep an eye on conditions. The fact that El Niño is a solid C student, kind of average, slightly underperforming, but might hang through the summer.
Let's hold that thought.
Okay.
Because I want to get to El Niño, but let's first do our tallying of the bets. We had a winter total precipitation bet. And then last month, we also doubled down, and the bet was about whether or not Tucson would end up in the top 10.
I remember that.
Yeah.
That's right.
For the January, February, March season, I'm claiming victory.
Fine. It's fine.
Yep.
Yeah.
I won 2 out of the 3 months. My estimate was 2.9 inches for Tucson. Mike's was 2.8. We were both completely wrong. We undersold it. It was a total of 3.74.
I like to be wrong in that direction. That's a good way.
And we were both optimistic because climatology was.
Yeah, we were pushing even as it was. Yeah.
However, last podcast, I went completely bullish and crazy and thought it was going to be a top 10. And we needed something like 1.8 inches, and we only got that one storm.
So there's been a couple of rain events around the Tucson area that have missed the airport, but have only put down a couple hundredths of an inch across town. So.
We needed 2 or 3 of those events. Yeah, I made that bet, though, without actually knowing what the numbers needed to be.
Which you often do, and I enjoy that part of it.
So I prepped for the next bet.
Which I did not.
You don't know this one. So I propose that we estimate the total number of days in May and in June, each month.
Total.
That are above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for Tucson.
What's the climatology?
I don't want to give it to you because then I give my all right, I'll do it. All right, do it. I only looked over the last 18 years because I wanted to get rid of the whole climate change thing. Okay. So this isn't a true climate. Good. This isn't a true climatology. This is just looking back from 2018 to 2000. So the average number in Tucson is 5. The max is 11.
For those 2 months?
For May.
Okay, for May. Okay.
For June, it's 22, with the max being 30, by the way, which is 2013.
Wow. Okay.
Brutal. I don't remember that. What do you think?
Okay, so what are we doing first? May?
Yeah, we'll do May first.
Okay, so the fact that El Niño is lingering and has actually screwed with the atmosphere a little bit right now suggests that may end up slightly cooler than average. And you said 5 is the average number of 100 days?
Yep, 5 is the average for May, and max is 11.
I'm going to give you 5 for May. Going right with climatology. I can't imagine, with trend on top of it.
It was 6 last year, 5 the year before. 0 in 2016, by the way.
Ooh, see, that was a lingering El Niño.
Oh, so get this, though. 2013 had 0 for May and then 30 for June.
Yeah. I think this is how it works for sure. I'm changing. 2.
You're going 2.
I'm going 2. I'm going 2 for May.
See, we already had a 97er. Right?
I know.
We already had a 90. So
I know. I don't feel good about this one.
I'm torn on this because I'm actually going to go above. I think it's going to be 6. Above the long-term average.
Okay.
And at the end of the month, we're going to have a series of days. High pressure is going to be around and enforced.
My gut tells me, and this is the trend issue. My gut tells me you're right, but it's working. The El Nino, I think, is actually a factor.
Could be right. 2015 was 2. That was a massive.
That was pretty gonzo.
I'm going with 6.
What did I say?
You said 2.
Okay.
All right. So June.
June. I'm gonna say we're gonna hit the gas and go 25.
23 last year, 25 the year before, 22, 23, 29, 30. I think it's going to be 20. I didn't work this out ahead of time, but that actually puts me right on climatology. 26.
Are we doing forecasting?
Yeah, but it's like...
Yeah, it's not useful.
We're doing statistical forecasting, actually.
Kind of, yeah.
I just did an eyeball regression.
Let's go. Nothing works better.
I controlled for myself on that one. Okay, so we'll see how that goes. Now let's end this with some preludes to the future. So you started, Mike, with talking a little bit about ENSO is still in play, and there has been talk that even though it's a hard time to forecast, that the models are suggesting that this El Nino will persist with higher chances that it'll ramp up. No indication on intensity yet, but it will ramp up into the winter. But sort of maybe not unprecedented, but uniquely that it will persist through the summer.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I'm so incoherent on this whole ENSO thing. It's like,
well, it's because it's really the
it's only
thing
game
to
in town,
grab
right?
a hold of.
Yeah, I know.
Otherwise, you're right. Just a meteorologist.
It's totally exactly. A meteorologist trying to forecast at non-meteorological timescales. Right. So that's exactly right. I keep going back to it because it is a persistent anomaly that's going to dump heat in the atmosphere in an unusual way, and it may continue to.
Is there an undiscovered influential mode?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Like something of the ilk of, in terms of influence of El Nino.
What do you mean?
Go back to prior to knowledge of the Southern Oscillation, El Nino and Southern Oscillation. Have we just not discovered something that's out there that is influential, substantially influential on our climate?
No.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. There's been some interesting papers. I think we just mentioned this. There was a paper in Nature maybe 6 months ago. Maybe it was a year ago. They actually saw some precursor, like if you go down the New Zealand index, I think it was what it was. And
some bridge.
Yeah, there was some bridge that connected all the way back up to ENSO and actually had a better lag forecast and better connections right down to Arizona than even ENSO did. But I think as we noted in there, the correlations were marginally improved over ENSO. And so there was still so much unexplained variance.
I think it's about just trying to better understand the processes for all of these different phenomenon that impact the weather in a given, and figuring out the strength of those.
Yeah.
And I mean, El Nino and ENSO will still be a dominant force, and it actually may. Its strength may wane as we go forward, both as a function of anthropogenic climate change, but also as a function of just sort of other influences blink on more strongly at different times. And we see this already.
Well, I think just in sort of first principles, though, that the equatorial region is getting most of the sun's energy, and it's the center of action of moving that energy out into other parts of the planet, right? So the energy imbalance emerges in the tropics and then propagates outward. So it will always be kind of one of the center, anomalies in that area are going to have probably the higher perturbations of any place else, and there'll be secondary. I'm not sure that other places will emerge to override that, right? But I think their interactions will be pretty complicated.
Well, and changes in the Arctic could throw
for sure, but it'll be an interaction. It won't be an overriding of that particular thing. And I think there's some paleo work that has suggested that the gradients change, and you have changes in the mid-latitudes.
Continental drift,
Pangea, baby. That's right. So Pangea is a problem we should be concerned about. Reverse Pangea.
I missed the Triassic.
So, what were we talking about?
I don't know.
I think you're actually talking about the summer. And why the heck I'm even invoking the cursed El Nino for any guidance into the summer.
How do you feel about the persistence of El Nino, and what's its
its
impact going forward?
So I think the persistence is it's why we use it is because it's a slowly evolving phenomenon that has persistence. And there is a slug, a downwelling Kelvin wave moving across the equatorial Pacific. Right. So it's warm water that will emerge later and reinforce the anomalies at the surface.
Right, and this is why it's expected to persist.
Right.
Because there's still warm water that's going to surface.
It's right. There's a train on the tracks and there's a crossing gate. Your forecast is that train will go through the crossing gate at so much time.
I think it's important to say that our forecast of the state of ENSO is much better than our forecast for what the precipitation and what precipitation would do.
That's right. But still, even the evolution of ENSO isn't the forecast of it is fairly complicated. Even when we see the anomalies emerge, like trying to forecast what the spatial pattern of the sea surface temperatures with El Niño is can get a little bit cloudy, pardon the pun. But then the atmosphere actually has to respond to that reorganization, and often it doesn't because it's getting pinged with noise from other weather systems and that kind of stuff. So that's typically peaks and is strongest. That teleconnection is in the wintertime. The spring is where you're getting sort of seasonal reorganization. And in the winter, we typically don't have, the jet stream isn't as important in those things. But you still can have subtle weak waves in the northern hemisphere in the summertime that can mess with the monsoon system. And so we can look at just some of the correlation maps, and you see a pretty weak correlation with the 500 millibar pattern, with the weak trough, weak ridge. The correlations are weak anyways, but the pattern would be similar to what we see with the monsoon ridge, but maybe slightly weakened, suppressed monsoon in July that then advances north climatologically as it would in August. And this is some of like Chris Castro's work where you see some correlation with El Niño winters lingering into spring, or even the evolution of an El Niño the emergence of an El Niño in the summer. If it's in place in July, it can cause the monsoon to come in late, but it's not every year.
We went back and looked at the ENSO data, and there's 14 since 1950. There's 14 summers, July, August, September summers that had an El Niño conditions.
Yeah, so Oceanic Niño Index above 0.5, which is the Climate Prediction Center.
Of those 14, there were 2 or 3 that actually that were coincident with above average monsoon rain.
Yeah.
And for the most part, they were
below average, or maybe nearish to below average, right? And
but I think what you were saying is a little bit more nuanced, which is that the correlation between ENSO and summer rainfall is only in July,
and it's only mostly in Arizona, right? So it's July in Arizona. Okay, number one, the correlation's not very good. It's fairly weak. What is correlated is typically suppressed precipitation in July, later onset of precipitation in Arizona with an El Niño event, which would lead to overall lower precipitation in July just because having it later start. But then that relationship breaks down in August and September. So most recently, 2015 didn't have that problem. Strong El Niño in place, 2015.
It's worth saying that it wasn't.
It wasn't. But man, I mean, I would take 2015 again.
Yeah, 2015 came at just above average, but it was always sort of hovering around average. No, it was a good monsoon.
It was as like spaced out and good selection of events as you would want.
The previous one to that, 2009, the monsoon however was a disaster.
So 2009 is one of our driest summers on record, which is
coincident
with an El Niño, and warmest because it was one of the driest. And that was our big concern back then, was that okay, El Niño causes dry summers, but it's just not enough.
Yeah.
There's not enough signal there for that to be a hands down on the Arizona side. The other thing that's in play here is the East Pacific hurricane season we would expect to be above average. Mm-hmm. And having kind of a weak trough off the California coast could cause recurving to be
early on, right?
Early on, yeah.
Actually, we had that in June.
That's right.
Last year.
And in 2015 too. 2015 with the El Niño conditions sort of hanging in there.
It's weird though, because that goes in opposite ways as the correlation we just talked about.
Well, it is, but the last year with the weak La Niña, there's also this mode called a Pacific Meridional mode, which is going to relate to the East Pacific sea surface temperatures that are going to drive some of that hurricane activity in the East Pacific. And so we've seen that kind of hang above average for the last couple of springs. So it's like there's so many moving parts that we can't just lay this on the shoulders of El Nino and even use it as a forecasting tool going forward. So I'll give you climatology for the summer.
All right, I think you got the last word on that.
Awesome.
I mean, I'm excited because
me too. I'm ready for it.
Yeah, the monsoon. I mean, it just flew by.
Such a good summer, such a good winter. I think I'll be okay with spring because we're only going to have 200-degree days next month, according to me, and then it'll be only 15 days till the monsoon starts.
Boy, that'd be great.
I know, it would be great.
All right, thanks everybody for spending another hour with us, and we'll come back in a month.
In May, talk monsoon.
Talk monsoon. Woohoo!
All day, all the time.
Do you recall what it was coming in? There was some.
There was some. It went from some to none. That's the level of quantification and sophistication we bring to this podcast. Oh, that's what that
is. Climatology.
I was wondering who C was.
We're well, it could be for
that was for Crimmins. I thought, did I make that guess?